The general plan land use map was last updated in 1974, and at that time there was no GIS, and it was a broad brush planned. It was designed in a very broad brush way, with most of it done by hand and not any kind of computer-aided technology. What we're doing today is, in fact, moving into the 21st century and doing this all on GIS, which is very helpful in terms of getting more detail and unearthing where the inconsistencies are, which will be very helpful down the road as we implement the general plan and in terms of our day-to-day permit processing and making sure that the general plan is consistent with the zoning ordinance. So what we have today are different parts of the city that we're looking at, and each one we have 3 different maps. And I'll walk through first just explaining what each map is, and then I'll go through some of the changes that we're seeing and that are being proposed for the new map. So the first map here is a illustration of the existing 1974 general plan land use map, and you see the underlying colors here are the land use designations. So this orange color is multifamily uses, the red color is commercial uses, green is parks, this magenta purple is office, blue is institutional uses, civic institutional uses, and over here is single family, this beige color. This is commercial here as well. It's a different type of commercial than this here. As we go through these maps, you'll see we'll get different colors, and I'll explain those as we go along in terms of the land use underlying land use designations. The second part of this map is a layer that we've superimposed onto the existing land use map, and it shows these black lines here. It shows our zoning districts. And you can even here begin to see some of these inconsistencies that we have between our land use designations and our zoning. So for example, in this area here between Garden Street and Laguna, these 3 blocks are designated on the general plan map as office, and yet the zoning, and here's the black zoning line here, is R3, so it's multifamily. So here it's consistent where you have land use designation in multifamily with an R3 zoning, but here you don't. This is office, and it's not consistent. So the next part of our analysis and our methodology was to look at what's on the ground today. So this map here shows you, and we derive this through surveys, on-the-ground surveys, and going through records to determine what we have on the ground today in terms of land uses. And again, we've transposed the zoning districts to help you understand and to give you some sense of continuity between that map, that tool, and this tool here. So again, if we look at these 6 blocks that I was pointing to earlier, you see that orange is a designation for multifamily, yellow is for single family, and blue is for institutional. So in looking at these, you can see it's pretty much all of it, with the exception of this institutional use here, all residential uses. That's very consistent with these 3 blocks, but again, not with these 3 blocks. And I'll flip back to this map here, and again, you see there's consistency here with existing land uses on the last map, and both the zoning and the land use designations. But here it's not. It's mostly residential, and so then what we're proposing for this area is to make this consistent with both the underlying land uses as well. So then we would flip to our third map, which is, this is the proposed land use map. And here you see these 3 blocks continue to be multifamily residential here. But these ones here, instead of having a designation as office, they now too also have a multifamily land use designation. So this brings this into consistency. Another area to focus on in this part of the city is the St. Francis area. And if you look at this area here that represents essentially St. Francis, the land use designation is institutional, represented by the blue color here. And if you follow the zoning boundary here, the CO is actually medical office, and so those are fairly consistent in of themselves. But the question is, now that St. Francis has been closed and this is now under construction for residential, which is consistent with the surrounding uses here of multifamily residential, then that should be reflected in the future land use map. So if we flip over here to what's on the ground today, the white represents that this is under construction here. But there is still these medical offices down here, some multifamily in a couple parcels, and then just outside of the zoning district, you do see some residential in here, which was represented as that blue institutional. So what's being proposed then on the future land use map then for that area here is to make this multifamily residential consistent with what's going on here. All right, so the next area the city want to focus on is what we refer to as the Milpas-Haley area. This being Milpas Street here, this being Haley here, mountains over here, ocean down this way. This first map shows the 1974 land use designations on the land use map, with orange being multifamily, red being commercial, gray being industrial, blue being institutional, green being parks, pink being office. The first thing I'd like to focus on is Milpas Street and looking at the parcels that front onto Milpas. You see here the land use designation is the gray color for industrial, facing right onto Milpas. And you look at the zoning classification here, this borderline here, it's actually commercial. So on this side, this is very consistent, having a M1 zoning classification and the industrial land use designation. But on this side, this is very inconsistent here. And in fact, when you turn to the existing land uses, as most people know, along Milpas you see mostly commercial uses. There are a few industrial parcels, but it's mostly commercial. So it's fairly simple when you pull back the commercial to here to face onto Milpas Street, and it then becomes consistent with the